I'm very excited to introduce Anna Matthews. She's a native Texan. She's with the American Bird Conservancy as the science coordinator for the Oaks and Prairies joint venture. She's based in San Marcos. She did a master's thesis. That's when I met her. She finished that in 2018 at Texas State. She worked on bobwhite, meadowlark, eastern meadowlark, and painted bunting. So we're very excited to have Anna talk about Loggerhead Shrikes. The title of her presentation is at the bottom, Survey 123 for Wildlife Data Collection, a Loggerhead Shrike Nest Monitor Example. So give me a second here, and I will give Anna the role to present. Try that, Anna.
Thank you, Cliff. Can y'all see my screen?
Yep, looks good.
All right, perfect. We will go ahead and get started then. Thanks for that introduction. And yes, I'm going to be talking about Loggerhead Shrikes today. So if you're interested in birds, I've got something for you. And I'll also be talking about Survey 123, which is a data collection app. So hopefully if you collect wildlife data in the field, we can spark some ideas for you potentially. So, of course, I could not be here today talking about this without our excellent team of people that have been working on this project. So I want to introduce them to you really quickly. So there is, of course, myself in the Oaks and Prairies joint venture, and Jim, who is the former coordinator for the Oaks and Prairies joint venture and is now the Central Regional Director for American Bird Conservancy. Both of us have been working on this project from the joint venture end. If you're unfamiliar with what a migratory bird joint venture is, Jim actually did a presentation, I believe, last month about these at this lunchtime webinar. But if you weren't able to attend that one, they are regional self-directed partnerships of government and non-governmental organizations that work together to deliver landscape level conservation for migratory birds and link national bird population goals with on-the-ground management. And as part of that, they also organize outreach, research, and monitoring to support those things. So the green area in the map is the Oaks and Prairies joint venture geography, but regardless of where you are in North America, you fall within the geography of a joint venture. So if you're curious to learn more, you can always check out our website. And there is a website for migratory bird joint ventures in general as well. I believe it's mbjv.org. Of course, the other major half of our team that we could not have done any of this without and have been absolutely critical to the development of these apps and getting out in the field and running our pilot season are Craig and Tanya from the Texas Nature Trackers program at Texas Parks and Wildlife. They do a lot of really amazing work with naturalists, including the Texas Master Naturalists and more, to engage with them and collect really robust and high quality community science data that can be used to contribute to research and conservation, especially for species of greatest conservation need, otherwise known as SGCNs. So they do a lot of really amazing work beyond this project that I'm going to talk about today. And I highly recommend that you check out some of the cool things that they're working on. So with that, I'm going to be talking today about a few different things. I'm going to give you all a brief intro. We're going to talk about grassland birds and do a really quick summary of what is a loggerhead shrike. And then we're going to jump into the birth of this community science project. I'm going to do a little bit of a demo on the apps that we developed. And then we'll do really quickly an overview of our pilot and some preliminary results from the data that we collected this past year and what we learned, what's next, and a very high level how to do it yourself. So with that, let's get started. So everything that we do when we make decisions about wildlife probably comes back to some kind of data that was collected somewhere. Certainly our decisions are influenced by other things beyond just data, but probably comes back to this data at some point or another. And that data isn't really useful for making those decisions until we turn it into some kind of product like a final report, a map, etc. And of course, getting it into that final product with which we can make those decisions is the really, really hard part. And it involves typically a lot of analysis, a lot of computer programs that we all probably use like R or ArcGIS, etc. And at some point, you probably feel like this, unfortunately. I know I do feel like this occasionally when I've stuck on something in R or ArcGIS. But fortunately, like everything else in life, there is an app for that. So if we think about how we collect data and what we do with it in the office, we kind of break it into a few steps. We go out and collect data in the field, and that's typically the fun part that we all enjoy doing. Even if it's hot and humid and we're covered in mosquitoes, that's the enjoyable piece. But then you have to go back to the office eventually, and all of the remaining pieces are waiting for you that you have to do at a computer. And that usually involves data entry. You got to clean it up and organize it. Then you got to figure out how to analyze it, prepare those results so they make sense, and then you have to share those results out. And that's all of the not so fun part. But like I said, there's an app for a lot of these things now that take all of that stuff and put pieces of it into the fun part where you're collecting data in the field. And I'm going to be talking today about just one example of where we've used some apps to take some of those not so fun things and put them into data collection itself. But I do have a caveat for you. You will never be able to completely escape the computer no matter what app is developed, unfortunately. Everything that I'm showing you today, we took a lot of time and actually the course of a couple of years kind of doing some trial and error and setting up these apps via computer programs. We did a lot of in-season management during our pilot, especially since this is kind of a trial season. We had to fix some things along the way. And for our very preliminary results, I did have to do some data cleanup and organization on the back end, although it was considerably less than I would have had to do if we didn't use these apps. And I did have to do a little bit of code writing. So unfortunately, you will still feel like this sometimes when you stare at your computer, but it will happen less frequently, hopefully. So with that, let's talk about birds and loggerhead shrikes and this particular project. So grassland birds, as I'm sure many of y'all know, are in extreme decline. There was a paper that came out back in 2019 from Rosenberg et al. That estimated we've lost around 3 billion birds in North America since the 70s. And of the suites of birds that they looked at, grassland birds were experiencing the greatest declines. We've lost around 700 million of those. And that includes species like the eastern meadowlark, and lesser known species, but just as important, such as the grasshopper sparrow and the loggerhead shrike. If we look a little bit closer at loggerhead shrikes, there's some cool things about them. If you've never seen a loggerhead shrike before, they can look a lot like other species like mockingbirds or phoebes. But if we take a closer look at all of these photos along the top row, these are all photos of loggerhead shrikes up here. And they've got some unique characteristics that set them apart from some of their lookalikes in the bottom row. So for example, they have these kind of interesting little robber masks, as I call them, that cover their eyes on their head. And we can see that some of their lookalikes, like the mockingbird and phoebe, don't have that. They also have some general differences in kind of their body shape and the shape of their head. They've got a very chunky head. And if we take a close look at their bill, they have this little raptorial bill. And if we zoom in even more and we look at the end of that bill, as we can see circled in this little photo, the second one from the left, we can see this little notch sticking out from the top mandible. This is actually called a toenail tooth, and it's something unique to the shrike family and the shrikes, the shrike family and the family of kestrels and falcons. So this is something that we don't see in a lot of birds, and it's a really cool feature that we see in shrikes. The loggerhead shrike is only found in North America. There are other shrike species that are found throughout the world, but the loggerhead shrike is unique to here in North America. Like I mentioned before, they've got that raptorial bill, so they are a raptorial songbird. So they will eat things like rodents, lizards, other small birds, really large beetles, grasshoppers, etc. And you may have heard of their nickname, the butcher bird. And this is a nickname that they've been given due to a specific behavior that they have. So they are predatory, and they will actually store their food in something called a larder, which is basically when they have taken their food item and they've speared it on some kind of sharp object. This helps them tear it apart, and it's also a place, of course, to store their food for later. So if you've ever seen like a dragonfly speared on some barbed wire, a frog on cactus spines or similar, that's likely a larder and a sign that you've got some kind of shrike nearby. Their distribution, again, ranges throughout southern North America up into North America into some parts of southern Canada. They are year-round residents in kind of that purple area that you see on the map. So within Texas, most of the shrikes that we have are year-round, but those shrikes that do breed further up north will migrate south into those year-round resident populations and further into Mexico. Texas actually supports around 6% of all of North America's breeding loggerhead shrikes. And during the winter, we have almost a quarter of all of the shrikes, or the loggerhead shrikes, that is, of North America. So Texas is a rather important part of their range and an important part of their full annual cycle. And of course, we can't talk about birds without looking at one of the mesmerizing maps that eBird produces. So this is just showing how their distribution abundance changes throughout the course of a year. And as we can see, Texas remains lit up for pretty much the entirety of the year, indicating that we do have a pretty substantial year-round resident population. Their habitat requirements are relatively specific. They are kind of an open grassland, savanna, scrubland species, but they really require 4 main pieces to always be present in their habitat. They require a perch from which they can hunt and also sing and call. They're going to forage in areas that have short grasses. So if the grasses are too tall, it's not suitable for shrikes. They can't find their prey and they can't capture their prey in it. They need places to impale their prey for larders. And when they nest, they really want to be nesting in densely branched or thorny trees. So places like shortgrass prairies, desert scrub, open woodlands, pastures, or old fields, those are all candidates for shrike habitat. But you also have some more interesting and unexpected candidates, such as parks and golf courses thrown in, because a lot of those places tend to meet some of these requirements. But why do we care about shrikes? Well, they are an SGCN in 34 states, and since the 60s, we've lost a whopping 76% of their population. They're even listed as federally endangered in eastern Canada. And within the Oaks and Prairies Bird Conservation Region alone, and that includes Dallas, Houston, San Antonio, and stretches up through North Texas into central Oklahoma, we see a 6% annual loss, which is rather concerning. And of course, we don't quite know what the source of this decline is. It's likely attributed to habitat loss and some other things, possibly pesticides or climate change, but we just don't know a lot about exactly where this decline is happening and why. So there's a lot of unknowns surrounding the species at this time. And that's kind of what gave rise to this community science project. Jim Giacomo, the coordinator for the Oaks and Prairies joint venture that I mentioned earlier, actually found a shrike population that was nesting in a suburb of North Austin, specifically Round Rock. And this presented an interesting opportunity for us to think about how we can collect some information to contribute to filling in that knowledge gap. And we decided that this would be a good opportunity to collect nesting and productivity data. So we wanted to monitor nests and we wanted to band birds with color bands so that we could track them over time and look at interactions between resident birds, migratory birds, and even maybe look at things like pedigrees. But this particular location of a public park in a suburb of Austin introduced this opportunity for us to use the help of community scientists to collect this data. So that's what we did. We decided we were going to have the help of community scientists for doing this nest monitoring. But we had a problem in that we had to think about how we were going to expand beyond this one park in the future. Ideally, we want to increase our sample size and include more locations across the state of Texas. So that meant we had to design this program in a way that will be able to collect that data, answer the questions that we want to answer, and be scaled up in the future beyond just this one park in Round Rock. And we had a couple of problems that we had to deal with in order to do that. We know how to monitor nests. That's been well established. That's not our issue. What we had to think about was how we're going to collect that data with a big group, a large geographic area, and a team of 3 to 4 people to kind of manage this project and manage the data. So I think it helps to think about how we collect data, field data traditionally, and why that doesn't work in this situation, because it helps us think about, okay, what do we need in order to fix these issues? So normally you go out in the field and collect your data on a paper data sheet. I know it's a point count data sheet, not a nest monitoring one. It's just a random example I found. You're going to take your paper data, put it into a database of some kind, and then at some point you might pull your data out of your database into Excel, or maybe you'll pull it into like ArcGIS or R or something. And then you're going to run an analysis on it. Again, might be in R, might be in ArcGIS, might be SAS, whatever your pet analysis program is. But when we start thinking about these steps in terms of a really big group, as opposed to what you might be used to dealing with in terms of like a graduate student that has a couple of volunteers helping collect data, or a small field technician team that you hire for a season, we start running into all kinds of issues with this traditional process. So we've got a bunch of people collecting data all across the state of Texas. How are we going to get that data entered into a database? Well, you might have them scan their data and email it to you, and you do the data entry yourself. But that doesn't work when you've got a lot of people sending you your data. You spend all of your time doing data entry and none of your time doing anything else. And you also run the risk of people forgetting to send it to you, data sheets getting lost, etc. So that doesn't quite work. So how do we circumvent that issue? Well, your next thought might be, okay, I'm going to have my volunteers enter their data into their own databases, and they can send me their databases when they're done. Well, that might be a problem too, because large geographic area, you got to train all of your volunteers how to use that database using some kind of virtual training, which could be difficult to pull off. Certainly easier nowadays than it was even just 2 or 3 years ago, but still could be complicated. And also you run the risk of not everyone's computer may be able to support that particular program. Some people might not be as technologically savvy as others, so you might have to do some remedial training and you just end up losing a lot of time to do that. And then your absolute last resort might be, okay, everyone's just going to put their data into an Excel file and email me their Excel file, or they're just going to put it in a Google Sheet. And been there, done that, all of a sudden you run into quality control issues, because all of those things that you built into your database to make sure people didn't make too many typos, or to make sure they didn't type, 100 when the values are supposed to range from 0 to 10. You've lost all of that by now switching over to Excel. You might be able to do some of that kind of thing in Excel, but you also run the risk of people accidentally changing your formulas or changing your settings or accidentally deleting other people's data in Google Sheets. So that doesn't really work too well. So finally, we get to our last step of doing analysis. And analysis is going to be handled with the 4 of us, with Tanya, Craig, Jim, and I. So that's not a major problem for us. We're not too concerned about that step. So really, we had to figure out how are we going to circumvent this data entry and kind of quality control issue that we cannot handle with this kind of normal process. And to do that, we turned to data collection apps. So all of these are apps that we explored for this project. Some of them I'm sure you've heard of before, like eBird and iNaturalist. Some of them you might not have heard of before, such as SitSci. I highly recommend you check SitSci out. They had some interesting possibilities in there. Google Forms is great too, depending upon what you need to do. If it's something pretty simple and straightforward, Google Forms might be all that you need for your data collection application or data collection form needs. But for us, those 4 options didn't quite meet the spatial needs and the data collection complexity needs that we had. So we turned to the suite of apps developed by Esri, and they have all kinds of apps ranging from Collector, which is the light blue, Quick Capture, which you might not have heard of before, which is the orange icon, Workforce, the red one, and then ones you may have heard of before, like Survey 123, which is the green icon, and Field Maps, which is the blue one. And after a lot of trial and error over the course of quite some time, we finally settled on this combination of these 2 apps, Survey 123 and Field Maps. And these 2 apps in conjunction would kind of achieve what we needed our volunteers to be able to see and do out in the field. So the Field Maps app would allow us to develop a map that people could use to track nest locations, navigate to nests. They could also look at the status of a nest by looking at the symbology for each nest location. And within this Field Maps app, they would have the ability to launch Survey 123, which would allow them to collect nest monitoring information with a specialized form that we developed within the Survey 1238. So they could look at things like the number of eggs, the status of the adults, whether or not they'd seen any banded birds, etc. So what does that look like? Well, Cliff, if you don't mind giving control over to my phone, I will do a little bit of a demo. Okay, here we go. Screen broadcast should be starting, and yep, looks like you can see my screen. Okay, so I'm going to open Field Maps on my phone, and this is kind of like a test version of the app that we developed that people could get some practice with. So this is what our home base looks like. So we have these 3 large icons and a bunch of dots over to the left-hand side of the screen. And we really wanted to make sure that people kind of had this home base to work from, so they weren't constantly flipping between Survey 123 and a bunch of forms and then have to flip back to Field Maps over and over and over again. So let's say that you're out in the field at this park where we're doing our pilot and you find a Loggerhead Shrike nest that you want to record. You can come into this home screen and click on this nest icon here that's parked in the lake. And when you do that, you will open up a pop-up that has a hyperlink in it. If you click on that hyperlink, it will open a survey in Survey 123. I don't have to sign in because I've set this up for anonymous users to use. And it will open up a form in which I can fill in information about that particular new nest that I found. So we've created all these questions that kind of impose some quality control because you're not typing in your name, you have to select it from a list. The date and time are automatically populated. And then we come down here, come down to this information about the nests that we're collecting. And it will automatically assign a nest ID. You can see it up at the top there. That nest ID is automatically assigned, so it's completely unique. You don't run the risk of anyone accidentally assigning the same name twice. And I can even select a location. We're going to move away so that you don't see where I live. Since this is being recorded, that might be a little weird. You can drop a pin for wherever your nest is located, even change the base map if you need to. And you can also select the height of the nest. You can type in what the substrate is. So I could type in that we found it in an oak tree. And one of the really cool things I think that Survey 123 allows you to do is incorporate photos into your form. So I can take a photo of the nest substrate, and you can see the presentation screen right there. I can take a photo directly within the app and attach it to basically all of the data that's being collected in this form. So that's really convenient, especially when you're actually trying to find those photos. It's already kind of attached with something that's a shapefile. Then, of course, you can start collecting information about the nest itself. So I'll say that this is a nest with eggs. I could take photos of the nest interior if I wanted to, put in the number of eggs, number of young. And again, we have drop-down lists here, so people can't accidentally type in that they found 22 eggs or something like that. And I can put in nest status. And we've also built in some of these questions that are conditional questions. So it's asking, are there any banded shrikes present? If I say no, nothing happens and I move on. But if I say yes, this additional question pops up. If I click a little plus sign, I can enter in the color combination for that particular banded bird. So I can put in that it had dark blue on the top on the left leg and dark green below. And on the right leg, I couldn't see what was on top, but I think it had metal. So I can even leave one of these blank if I need to. And I could add in additional birds if I wanted, if I saw 2 birds that were banded at this nest. I can take additional notes, and then if I wanted to record the final fate of this nest, I could say yes, and it would allow me to put in information about the number of young that were fledged, if it was a successful or a failed nest, take additional photos, etc. But I'm going to go ahead and say no. And then when I'm done, I hit this little check mark, and it really wants a location, so okay, we'll just put that location. So you can build in required questions like that where it will not allow you to submit your data until you answer it. So I hit this little check mark, and then I can either send my data right now, or I can continue the survey, or I could save it to the outbox. If I send my data now, it automatically goes into the cloud and is immediately available for me to look at in ArcGIS Online. If I save it to the outbox, I can send it in later. So this means that you can actually download some of these surveys and these maps so that you can use them offline and then submit your data once you come back into service range. So all of these things can actually be utilized when you're out in the middle of nowhere. There's just some extra steps that you have to kind of build in to make sure that they will work. So I'm going to come back to field maps here, and I'm back at my home base, and let's look at some of these dots over here. So what do these mean? These are all locations of nests, and if I look at my legend, the blue dots indicate active nests and the red ones indicate inactive nests. So this is really helpful to make sure that your volunteers don't check nests that don't need to be checked anymore. And if I click on one of these little dots and I open up the pop-up associated, I can actually see the information that was collected at this particular nest in the past. So this is really helpful when you're doing nest monitoring and data collection, because let's say your nest history was person A checked a nest on day 1 and there were 2 eggs. Person B checked a nest on day 5, there were 4 eggs. Person C checked the nest on day 6 and there were no eggs, no signs of anything. If you don't have a record of what happened at that nest when the prior 2 people checked it, then person C doesn't know that something interesting happened, and maybe they should take a closer look and see if there are signs of predation. So having this information about what was going on previously is super helpful. Additionally, if I click collect data, I can collect data about this particular nest. It looks the same as the form that we filled out for a new nest, but if I scroll down, it automatically populates in the nest ID, the nest location, information about the height, etc. Looks like this particular one doesn't have some of that info. And then once again, I can start putting in information about the nest itself. So I could say it was recently fledged and unknown, put in all kinds of numbers here. So you get the gist of it, and then I can submit that data. So I'm going to stop sharing my phone screen. Cliff, could you give control back to my computer, please? Okay, here we go. Okay, so it should be back to my computer screen now. And these were just placeholders in case my phone demo didn't work. Okay, so I mentioned all of your data goes up into the cloud and is immediately available for you to look at. So this is an example of what that looks like. So this is a Survey 123 website. And as you can see, there's the locations of all of these nests from kind of our test sandbox version of the app. If I clicked on any of these points, it would again pull up a pop-up that shows me some of those information about that nest, etc. And all of that data is also uploaded into ArcGIS Online. If you don't have a lot of experience with ArcGIS Online, it's basically an online version of sharing like shapefiles, feature layers, all kinds of things that you create in ArcMap and ArcPro, you can upload into ArcGIS Online. But your Survey 123 project automatically creates these feature layers and everything that are associated with ArcGIS Online. And those are what are automatically updated whenever you upload new data to your survey through the survey form in your phone. So all of that data is immediately available in attribute tables, in shapefiles and CSVs that you can then download. So pretty cool stuff that's really powerful. But what do all those slides mean? Well, basically, or that demo mean, what does that demo mean since we didn't use the slides? Your volunteers go out and they collect data on their phone, and they're also doing data entry and some quality control on their phone as they're collecting data as well. All of that's immediately sent to the cloud. It's immediately formatted into the standard online file type. You can then take that file that's in that online format and pull it into a map or look at it on a table. And that map can then be pulled into something like Field Maps, the app that we were using to navigate and click on those nests on my phone. So that's kind of how those two kind of fit together. And all of that data is also immediately available to download for analysis. And both those online files and of course the data that you download. You can share all of that using online maps, using dashboards a la the COVID-19 dashboards we saw a lot of in 2020, story maps and more. And you can do all of that and show live updates as you're getting data in from your Survey 123 app that you develop. So all of that's really kind of changing how we do data collection and how we share that data for wildlife and other industries. So hopefully you can see how not only you can do kind of data entry and quality control, but by marrying some of these apps with dashboards or online maps, you can also do data sharing and even some data reporting kind of within data collection itself, as long as you set up these things in the correct way in advance. So let's talk about the pilot and the prelim really quickly. So we did a pilot just this past year. We built all our apps. We developed kind of the monitoring methods and everything. And then we finally were able to test it this past year in 2021. You got a sneak peek of how many nests we saw. Tanya and Craig were absolutely essential in putting all of this together. They found some Texas Master Naturals chapter members that were excited to help us kind of pilot and test this out. They developed an online webinar to show them how to monitor nests and how to use the apps. And then they put together a follow-up field session to get some practice with the apps, get some practice with looking at shrikes, etc. And then we let the volunteers go out and continue to collect their data. And Tanya and Craig were great at kind of helping coordinate them and answer questions. And yeah, none of this would have been possible without Tanya or Craig's assistance. So make sure you give them all a big thank you. I know I'm very thankful for all of their help. We just actually finished collecting data just a couple of weeks ago. So we have some very, very preliminary data to show you. So take all of this with a grain of salt, but I think we saw some cool things at least. We managed to check or find that is 51 nests at just this one park in Round Rock, Texas. There were a few nests where we weren't sure what happened with them. It was either just completely unknown or we weren't able to record what was going on at the very end of the field season because they were either still going at the end of our field season. Shrikes have a very long kind of nesting period, or we just didn't check them often enough to ever be able to record a fate. But we did have 15 that were successful. That means they fledged at least one baby out of the nest and 17 that failed. When they failed, most of the time we weren't sure what was going on. That's not uncommon with nest monitoring unless you're out there almost every other day or even every day. It can be hard to kind of catch what happens. But we do know that 5 of them were predated and 1 was abandoned. And we actually had a couple of interesting stories pop up from those predation events. One volunteer observed blue jays pecking holes in eggs in a shrike nest. And I believe another one actually saw a Cooper's hawk like attacking the nest, which was pretty cool. If you look at their substrate that they're nesting in, they seem to vastly prefer nesting in oak species, especially live oaks. And almost all of their nests this year, with the exception of 2, were over 6 feet tall. So that makes it very difficult to check them. And selfie sticks were used quite frequently, and painter's poles were used quite frequently to get our phones up close to the nest so that we could take a video of what's going on inside and record some of that data. On average, our clutch size was just under 5 eggs. We hatched around 3 3/4 of those, and around 2.5 of those would actually fledge and leave the nest. That's actually pretty typical to lose a bird at each stage of this process. So that's not too alarming, but I do think it's pretty good that we're getting around 2.5 birds fledging out of these nests where eggs were actually laid. And if we look at the distribution of where we're finding nests and where they tend to fail and where they tend to succeed, across the park, there's not really any one area where they constantly seem to fail. So that's a good sign because that means that we likely don't have any parts of the park that are acting as kind of like a sink or kind of a trap for these birds when they nest. Because they're banded as well, we also suspect that some of these birds are pretty persistent. You can kind of see some clumpings of some of these points, some of these nests. Those are probably the same pair that are trying multiple times. And it's interesting that they'll try, really not that far at all from where they had a failure. So what did we learn? What's coming up next? If you're trying to develop these apps, take your time. Make sure you do a lot of testing. Keep it simple and visual. Get your GIS staff involved sooner rather than later. I think that's the regret that Tanya and I had, is we wish that we'd gotten Christy Birch at Texas Parks and Wildlife involved sooner than we had. Be ready to make adjustments during the field season. There's always going to be things that break or don't work that you have to fix. And keep in mind, you will have data cleanup and organization to do afterwards in some way, shape, or form in all likelihood. And if you're working with community scientists, I think it's really important to communicate with them that you appreciate their patience with you as you're trying to figure these things out and test these apps, and encourage them to share feedback about things that work and things that don't, and encourage them when something doesn't work to share screenshots. Pictures are worth 1,000 words, or describe in detail what went wrong rather than just say, hey, this screen just didn't do what it was supposed to. We will continue to learn from this pilot program over the course of the next few months, leading into the next year. And hopefully we'll be able to create a dashboard and some story maps to share out some quick stats and information. And we're hoping to expand to some new areas of Texas in the next couple of years, and even work with the Loggerhead Shrike Working Group and some other programs to potentially expand outside of Texas into other regions of the Shrike range. So I promised there'd be some really high level how to do it yourself. And again, this is really high level. I'm not going to get into the nitty gritty of how we made each and every question. But if you are interested in using Survey 123, there are a couple of different platforms in which you can create your survey. So this is the ArcGIS Survey 123 website. You can either use a web designer that you can access through the website to develop your survey, or you can use this desktop app called Survey 123 Connect to develop your survey. So let's look at Web Designer. The Web Designer is really easy to use. You can basically click and drag your question choice types from the right-hand side of the screen here onto the form, kind of in the left central part of the screen. And then you can just edit that question type that you select to ask your question and put in the possible answers. You can also build in some conditional questions here. You can build in, I believe, some constraints to answers like value ranges and things like that. But the web designer does not allow you to do some of the really advanced complexities that some survey types require. So if you're trying to do something more complex like we did, you really do have to look into using the Survey 123 desktop, Survey 123 Connect desktop application. So this application is really cool because it allows you to see how your survey looks as you are creating your questions. So this will update as you basically save your format for your survey design. But the catch is you have to create your survey within this Excel kind of template format. It looks a lot scarier than it is. It's actually not that difficult to learn how to create questions using this format. But it does look pretty intimidating the first time you kind of delve into it. There are lots of really great tutorials and videos out there, though, produced by Esri and just freely available on YouTube as well, that will show you kind of how to develop these and walk you through it step by step. And of course, don't forget that when you create your survey in Survey 123, it creates corresponding feature layers in ArcGIS Online that you can then pull into web maps and use in apps like field maps like we did, or put into collector, or you can also pull that information into things like story maps, dashboards, and a whole host of other tools and resources, both within Esri and even beyond all of the tools that Esri develops. And like I said before, there's all kinds of great videos out there to kind of help you get started. This is just a random one that I found that shows you how to link together Survey 123, story maps, web maps, and dashboards. So I actually might go watch this one later, we'll see. But lots of great resources out there. And if y'all have questions too about kind of developing some of these, I'm happy to try to answer those too. So with all of that, thank you so much for your time. A big thank you to Craig and Tanya for letting me borrow some of their slides through this presentation, and for contributing some really great photos too, as you can see here. And I would love to take any questions if y'all have any.